Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we wish a very happy birthday to the late Allan Holdsworth. Now, while it's always controversial to say someone is the best, if you were to ask 9 out of 10 guitar players who was the best guitar player of all time, I would say that 9 of them would say that the best is Allan Holdsworth. And don't take it from me. Take it from two of the very best guitarists of all time, Eddie Van Halen and Frank Zappa, both of whom said on the record very publicly that Allan Holdsworth was the best. And because Allan was never really good at promoting himself and wasn't always known to play well with others in a social and sociological sense, he needed all the promo he could get. Now, he took charge of his solo career firmly in the beginning of the 1980s, and he never really looked back. And luckily now, all of his solo albums are on your Spotify's, your Tidals, your Amazons, your Apples for you to listen to. But there's a lot of stuff from Allan Holdsworth before he became Allan Holdsworth in the 80s, where he was, lo and behold, still Allan Holdsworth, but playing with other bands. And I just want to run through a few of these. There was a band called Tempest, which was around in the early 70s, just for a few years. It featured John Heisman, wonderful drummer, known for his work in the various iterations of Colosseum, which are all good, especially Colosseum 2 featuring Gary Moore. And their first album featured Allan Holdsworth, and it really shows him in an unusual setting because it's a borderline sort of early heavy metal album. It's certainly hard rock and hard progressive rock at that. And it's really interesting to hear him in that setting because he is still very much Allan Holdsworth, but he's playing very un-Allan Holdsworth-like music. He then played with another wonderful British jazz fusion collective led by the wonderful brass player Ian Carr. And this band was called Nucleus. He was only with them for a single album called Belladonna, one of their best. Check it out. Certainly a bit more in his element there than with Tempest. And I would say that in many ways, the most interesting year for Allan Holdsworth before his solo career took off proper was 1975 because he recorded two seminal albums. The first that was recorded early in that year was Bundles by Soft Machine, possibly the most well-known and beloved British jazz fusion band ever. And it was really the first time that they had a guitarist permanently as a full-time member. They had other people guest on guitar before, but they were generally a guitar-free band up until that point. And Bundles was really an album that was built around Allan Holdsworth's guitar. And that lineup of Soft Machine played at the wonderful Montreux Jazz Festival. I think a lot of those clips are on YouTube, and you can see just how good a young Allan Holdsworth was then. Then later in that year, we're still in 75, he played on one of the best albums of all time, Believe It by the new Tony Williams Lifetime. This is possibly the best fusion album ever because it's complete, it's concise, it's virtuosic, it is exciting as hell, and even has some super memorable riffs. And everyone on it is a virtuoso. Tony Williams, my favorite drummer of all time, Alan Pasqua, great keyboardist. We did a video on him. Definitely check out Believe It if you haven't before. By the late 70s, he had joined Bruford's band called Bruford. So this is Bill Bruford, the drummer. He was in King Crimson. He was in Yes. He played live for a year with Genesis, the king of sort of English prog rock drummers. But he wanted to do something more in the jazz fusion realm. And so he formed the band Bruford, which was a fusion band. He had Allan Holdsworth on guitar. He had Dave Stewart on keys, no relationship to the Dave Stewart keyboard player of the Eurythmics, Jeff Berlin on bass, great bass player, and of course Bill Bruford on drums. And the albums that they did together, Feels Good to Me and One of a Kind, especially, really good stuff. And between those two albums, they even had time, this is both Bruford and Holdsworth, to join John Wetton, formerly of King Crimson and once in Future of Asia, along with the great violinist and keyboardist Eddie Jobson, to record the first album of UK. a progressive rock band. And that's one of the best progressive albums of all time, if you ask me. And it features what some have called Allan Holdsworth's best guitar solo ever on the song In the Dead of Night. A suite of songs, really. Then, of course, in the 80s, he became Allan Holdsworth, and he started playing with some of the best musicians ever. People like Jimmy Haslip on bass, wonderful bass player. Chad Wackerman, frequently on drums of Zappa fame. Also, he played a lot with Gary Husband on drums. He did work again with Alan Pasqua. And it was sort of that sort of ecosystem of musicians that would on and off play with him for most of his solo career. And all of his solo albums are just exposés in how to be a great guitar player. Yeah, less accessible than Eddie Van Halen, my favorite. Less accessible, arguably, than John McLaughlin, another of my favorites from the jazz and jazz fusion side. But in terms of virtuosity, everyone loved Allan Holdsworth, and you can really see why. Check out his solo stuff. Check out the stuff I mentioned before his solo career took off. Love it all. Gone too soon. Rest in peace, but we love you, Allan Holdsworth. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.